This session is really a revision session to help you understand the activities that take place in each of the processes that take place within each of the iterations. Just to remind ourselves, we know this structure very well. We've got the overarching time frame. That is divided into iterations. On the left there, we have iteration 1, and then we have subsequent iterations, however many are relevant for your change. We have the outcome defined for each of those iterations, and we manage each iteration using the same 3 repeatable processes of getting started, making progress, and realizing benefits. What I've done in this particular session is I've used blue to denote iteration 1 and green to denote iteration 2. And particularly we want to emphasize that the outcome of iteration 1 is the description of how the change will be managed, whereas the outcome of iteration 2 and onwards will be the changes needed to realize the benefits. So the outcome of iteration 2 onwards is the new ways of working that you're creating, the actual change that you are implementing. Let's look at this in more detail. So, getting started, there are 2 steps within the process of getting started: discover and plan. Now, bearing in mind that iteration 1 is all about creating the description of our change, the scope of our change, and knowing how we're going to manage our change. What we do in the discover step is we research the reasons for the change. We look for what are the driving forces within our organisation and our marketplace that means that this change is a good idea. We gather information on all of the other initiatives that are taking place in our organisation. We look at the strategic objectives, the widest possible picture of what it is our organisation is trying to do. We also use things like speeches and memos and presentations by executive and senior management. We look at the current problems that we're facing. We look at what other organisations are doing. We basically have a big brainstorming set of ideas about what is it that we're trying to create. Having got all of those ideas, that's a good bedrock. We now start to think we are going to have to shape this into a real sort of plan and scoping document for the change. So what we do is we think about what it is we're going to create in getting started, and we plan who's going to be doing that work. What makes iteration 1 unique is that we already know the sorts of documentation we're going to create. In this course, I've suggested 5 documents or 5 pieces of collateral, if you like, that are generic. They are relevant for any kind of change. So we already know what iteration 1 is going to produce. So what we need to think about is, do we need to add anything else to that? And we need to think about who's going to be doing it, so that we can then get on to the second process of iteration 1, which is we actually make progress. And what we do is, under the heading of change, we're creating the roadmap contents. And those roadmap contents are the description of the change. So it might include a vision statement. We will work out what the scope and the exclusions are, what should be included, what should be excluded. What is it that we're trying to achieve? So what are the expected deliverables? Are there any assumptions or constraints? And how does it link with other work? Now, the business case is often very well defined in an organisation. You often already have a template. So I'm not going to say much other than this is where we're going to capture the benefits, along with the risks and the costs. The change management strategy is our opportunity to say how we are going to manage the change. So we'll work out who we're going to be working with, and we'll start to organise those into different roles. So we'll create some kind of organisation structure for the management of this change from beginning to end. We'll think about how these people are going to work together and how they're going to get the work done. So how do they escalate risks? How do they deal with issues? How do they manage their time between their business as usual responsibilities and working on the change? How are they going to check the quality of each other's work and the quality of the change that they're implementing? How are they going to track their progress, and are they going to report it? And if so, how and to whom? The change management plan, well, really, the basis of any plan in this agile approach is going to be the roadmap, because the roadmap sets out the time frame, it sets out the repeatable processes of getting started, making progress and realizing benefits. But it also puts in there key decision points and the resources that we're using. We might even start to look at streams of work within each step of making progress. And again, we'll be thinking about any assumptions and constraints that we have to consider. And finally, we'll either create a separate plan for the communication activities, or we'll identify what the communication activities are and include them in the change management plan. But we know that we have to have regular information that goes out to everybody that's impacted by the change, because we're trying to maximize their motivation and therefore their participation. We want their support for the change. We need them to become involved. Otherwise, we won't achieve the change. These are the 5 key documents that we create in iteration 1. And I'm taking a little bit of time to make sure that we understand what this iteration delivers for us, because in later sessions, I'm going to give you more detail on getting started, making progress and realizing benefits for iterations other than iteration 1. So I want to make sure that we know iteration 1 is special because we already know what it is we're creating, and it's these 5 key pieces of information. Once we've created them, we'll test against our acceptance criteria for them. So before we get started, we'll make sure we know what good looks like. If there's already a sort of template in use in your organization, we'll adhere to that. If not, identify what's the minimum information requirements we need to make. This diagram is examined as part of the Agile Change Agent certification, and it basically describes the relationship between these 5 outputs. The description of the change describes the scope of the change. And of course, the narrower the scope, the fewer the benefits that will be included in the business case. The wider the scope, the more benefits that will be included. But of course, the wider the scope, not only do the benefits increase, but also the costs are likely to increase as well. So there's a symbiotic relationship between the description of the change, i.e. the scope, and the business case. Looking down the bottom, the description of the change also triggers our approach, how we're going to manage the change. Because if we have a wide scope, then we're going to have to involve a lot of people, and there's also the risk of destabilizing the business as usual environment. So we're going to have quite a tight strategy, really understand how it is we're going to approach managing this change so that we take into account those risks. Running along the top, the business case actually contains the benefits. And as we'll look at in the business need lesson, we see how important those benefits are to our communication activities, because what we're doing is we are marketing the benefits to everybody who's on our community map, everybody who's impacted by the change, because we want them involved. So whatever the benefits are in the business case, they will have quite an effect on the communication activities. The change management strategy sets out who we're going to be working with and how we're going to be working. And of course, that is going to be reflected in the activities we put into our change management plan. That change management plan will have the structure of the roadmap we're studying right now, but we will be dependent on whatever we decide in our strategy. How we're going to manage things will obviously affect what activities we put in there. And of course, there's a connection there between the change management activities captured in our plan will only get done if people are participating, and people will only participate if we're communicating what it is we're achieving and what the benefits are and what a great change we're actually needing. So those are the 5 outputs created in iteration 1. And then what happens is we get to the end of iteration 1 and there's this last process of realizing the benefits. We deploy what it is we've created. So We share the roadmap, the contents of the things we've created, and we explain the roadmap structure to all those who are going to be involved from this point on. We respect the fact that there's an awful lot of busy people who are trying to balance getting involved with the change and running their day job. So we only share the absolute minimum. And the minimum is at least explain the scope of the change and the business case, because that, of course, creates the benefits. And understanding the benefits will help people prioritise what work to include and what work is not so essential, because the most important work to do is the work that creates the biggest benefits. If they can see the business case, they know what those benefits are. And of course, once we've put that in place, we want to celebrate and thank everybody for the creation of the work from iteration 1 and create a motivation to want to get involved in iteration 2 onwards. Now let's look at iteration 2, which is the footprint for all subsequent iterations. And a whole point of this is a structure that you can use on any type of change. So getting started, making progress, realizing benefits, these steps remain constant, whatever it is you are trying to create. So it gives you an easy to follow structure that's repeatable for any type of change. So getting started is discover and plan, just like it was in iteration 1. So discover in this case is not discover information about the whole change, but now to think about using the information from iteration 1. What is the business case? What is the description of the change? Therefore, what is the business need we need to satisfy? What areas of the business do we need to change? What are all the ideas about what it is we're going to change and what we're going to leave the same? And we're going to work together collaboratively to do this. So we'll have workshops, we'll get together face-to-face, we'll get together on video conferencing, we'll use interviews and surveys and questionnaires, and we'll consult with people. We want as many people's ideas as possible each time. Those that are connected with actually working in the new way, we want to hear what they need to have happen. Once we've got all of the activities, the key thing that happens in plan is that we then prioritise this work into the must-haves, the should-haves, and the could-haves. This idea of the MOSCO prioritisation: must, should, could, and in fact won't have this time. Some of the work that we come up with in Discover, we might decide it doesn't really help us achieve our benefits, so we won't do it. It won't have this time. We might do it later, but we're not going to do it right now. It's also important to make sure that we don't start any work without understanding what good looks like. So it's really important to not only prioritise the work, but understand what the acceptance criteria for each piece of work is. You don't want to do a piece of work and then not know what criteria it's going to be tested against or reviewed against. If I create a PowerPoint presentation and I don't ask a client, do you want it to be in your format or my format? Then I would probably do it in my format. And at the end of that work, they look and go, we like what you've put on the slides, Melanie, but we don't really like the format of it. Could you go back and rework it? Well, what a waste of time that is. You never want to start work on something unless you understand what good looks like. What criteria will allow this work to be accepted as complete and therefore ready for deployment. So in plan, you mustn't leave the plan activity without understanding those acceptance criteria, which of course, in making progress, you then apply. So we create the changes in the working practices, and we identify as well, not just process changes, but changes to attitudes, behaviours, how people do their work, who they work with, what equipment they use, when they do their work, where they do their work. All of those things are the things that we're changing. And of course, we'll review every change that we create against those acceptance criteria to make sure that it works. And it's iterative development, one of the key concepts of Agile. So if the work fails the review, if it doesn't pass its test, we go back and fix it. Because we're coming to the end of the iteration, entering realizing benefits, we need to have work that we know has passed its test, it's reviewed, so that we can deploy it. So we make those changes available for use. We support people as they start to adopt these new ways of working. And a key thing is that we may have been working with some people from the business in making progress. They have been helping us create the changes, but that probably isn't everybody who's impacted by the change. So if you need to train anybody in what it is you've created, you'll do this as part of that deployment step. Alongside deploy, we also dismantle, which means that we remove anything that relates to the old ways of working that we're no longer going to be using, whether that's systems or stationery or standard letters that we send to customers, or agenda items or team meetings that we no longer need to have. We take away things that would encourage people to not adopt the changes. So we want to make sure that it's as easy as possible to adopt the new ways of working. And of course, what we want to do is we want to celebrate that. We want to thank people for all their hard work, and we want to celebrate the achievements. So as soon as we can, we start to identify the benefits, the improvements, the advantages that we have created as a result of this iteration. And of course, we will update the documentation that we started in iteration 1, but of course we continue to use, so the description of the change and the business case, but also the change management strategy and the change plan. All of these things will get updated at the end of the iteration, and we'll review it again as we use it when we go right back to the beginning and we start with getting started, the discover and plan step, but this time for iteration 3.